All right, we're live.
Hi, how are you?
Great. How are you?
Very glad to be here. And it's our second episode of Gen Blend.
Let's go. Let's go.
So it's great to be with everybody again today. I am Sophie Wade. I'm a work futurist, workforce innovation specialist, and founder of Flexel Network. And we upskill leaders to manage multi-generational thriving teams.
And I'm Danielle Farage, Gen Z speaker and strategist, helping bridge gaps between generations through learning and authentic connection.
So this is our second episode, and we're going to be discussing a topic that is near and dear to Danielle's heart.
Yep, we are here to work through and solve multi generational issues at work. And today we're talking about professionalism and what it should mean today.
Exactly. So the first, we want to actually jump right into our first segment, which is our Fast Four news series, and we address hot topics which are circulating in the news in the last couple of weeks. And the first one we have today is about conflict at work. And I just want to look at it. So it's about reducing the cost of workplace conflict. And the statistics are staggering. Close to 10 million people a year experience workplace conflict, which is stress, anxiety, depression that result from it, as well as a loss of productivity. And of course, people, leaving their workplaces, they resign, and other issues from, lower morale and stuff like that from disgruntled employees. Danielle, we have a feeling of how much conflict there is a result of intergenerational issues in the workplace. What are you finding in terms of miscommunications, misinterpretations, and what that is, how that's affecting you and your friends in the workplace?
Yeah. So I think there are a lot of sort of miscommunications that happen. And what I always like to do is to focus on the positive, right?
Mhm.
How do we
Right.
solve this and move forward? And so I have a three-step process, which I teach a
Okay.
lot of young professionals in the workplace. And it really is more of this emotional regulation practice,
Mm,
which I do in my own life when confronted with conflict. So the first step is to step away, right?
right.
None of us do well when we respond immediately, and based on emotion. And so I always like to step away. The second step is to seek advice.
Mhm.
And to go to my friend tours, to go to my mentors, to go to my friends, my family, my mom, and to gather their sort of opinions, and then third step is to return to the conversation
Okay.
and do it in a way that is really respectful, and it's curious. It's asking a question of, you said this thing. I'm
Mm,
wondering what you meant by that, right?
right.
Or opening the conversation, giving other people the benefit of the doubt.
Yes, and very much I go to that empathy step, and I look at how that we can actually create the environments that reduce the conflict, that don't sort of allow things to escalate to that point. And so it really is about empathy. It is creating the relationships among a team so that we don't have a situation where the emotions can be elevated like that, or a leader or manager can see that something is amiss, whether it might be somebody coming in after terrible traffic and or a difficult situation when they come on a video call, and allowing them to take that moment because they're aware enough of the other person, what they're normally like, how they're normally interacting. And so there's a need, we have a need to take a few moments to like bring everything down to the right level. So empathy for me is about, it is exactly that. It is listening, it's sort of looking out for other people, thinking about what situations they're in, and so creating a different environment, which does overall reduce conflict.
Right. And also recognizing that people have different ways of communicating. We were talking about this the other day, that a friend of mine created an actual dictionary
Okay.
to document Gen Z slang, and used it not only for her team to help them understand Gen Z better and to help, the intergenerational communications within their team, but then was asked to present it, to a company-wide level. And I think it's just such a beautiful example of creating this safe space for those differences to not only be, shared, but also highlighted.
Very much so. And I think when people have common language, common ground, or shared memories, so it doesn't have to be we have the same background, but we can connect about TV shows or the teams that we support or the things that we like to do at the weekend, all of those different things, including shared understanding about the language or emojis and things like that, can really give us a way to be able to communicate much more effectively together and avoid those miscommunications that lead to conflict.
Definitely. All right, let's move on to our next news story, which is there is a general Gen Z dissatisfaction with and at work. It's
Mm.
coming out of India, which is their youth unemployment rate is staggering.
Oh, wow.
And we all know this. Gen Z is increasingly unhappy at work. There are statistics to support 44% reporting satisfaction. And
Oh, wow.
there's a lot of situations, right? There's a lot of challenges, including values misalignment, lack of recognition, limited career development, and also the chaotic entry, right, of graduating into the pandemic and logging on as a remote employee.
Yeah.
And so only 27% of Gen Z feels happy at work. So with this dissatisfaction that not only is supported by stats, but also personal, stories that I'm hearing from my friends.
Right.
What do you think are what do you find are the best ways to start to change workplace dynamics for the better for this generation?
I look, I think that overall we have a very different environment, and it's not just Gen Zs who want to have a different environment who are sort of showing dissatisfaction or who feel dissatisfaction. I think many other generations do, but as a Gen Xer or for boomers too, that we never felt that we could speak up or totally
Mm,
wasn't appropriate to be speaking up, and so we didn't. So I think that there are ways to be changing the dynamics, and it doesn't have to be on you guys to be the ones who are sort of like explaining and or challenging us or appear to be challenging us to try and change things and improve things. So I think when we all, particularly older generations, can put ourselves in generate or younger employees' shoes and be listening and kind of trying to understand what the new dynamics are, what the situations are, the lack of job security that you have, and really trying to understand how things have changed so that we don't have to be interpreting it in the same way and thinking that, okay, well, they shouldn't be saying that because it's not appropriate to speak up, going to this professionalism aspect indeed. So I think that's one way that we can be thinking differently about that.
right, right. No, I love that. And it's actually something that I teach too with young professionals, right? It's not necessarily just about speaking up, but it's also about coming to the table with solutions. And, and how that reflects on you is being a self-starter, being able to collaborate, being, resilient. And I think the slang dictionary is a great example of that. It's not, oh, I wish people understood me more, or I wish I could use slang. Like, why don't you understand this?
Yeah,
And it's
yeah,
and it's more, well, let me sit down and explain this to you. And here's why it's important for you to understand. Well, their user base is highly Gen Z centric. So
yeah.
for their employees to actually understand Gen Z is a very big priority for the organization.
And I really appreciate it as boomers and Gen Xers can say, let me and millennials too, can be taking this these suggestions, these contributions and ideas and solutions as positive, kind of like, I care, I want to stay at this organization, I want to improve it. Let's improve it together. It's not just how I want it to be, but let's work on it together to create a better solution, a better environment for everybody. So I think having that perspective
Right.
is important.
Yeah, and something to really understand too about Gen Z is that we are very communal. We are all
Right.
about, social impact and business for good and but we might not know how to actually communicate
Mm.
it. And so at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. So let's let's learn how to communicate that better.
Exactly, exactly. Okay, so number three is actually, so this is a positive development. It's a boomer who's explaining that why millennials struggle at work and saying that it is a lot harder than it was. And really, the article goes into how, for example, applying for jobs is harder. And now, particularly when companies it's very hard to find anybody at a company who with whom to have a dialogue and really sort of try and sort of worm your way in, so to speak. So I think there's I think there's encouragement in this article because the boomer is recognizing that that situation has changed and it is a very different dynamic.
Yeah.
But I'm also and sort of seeing that millennials are now in those rising leadership positions and prime career situations. But my question is are they actually reacting with that understanding? If they have it, are they reacting to the different impact that has on millennials and Gen Zs in terms of what their situation is and how that's affecting how they're reacting and interacting and the things that they're stressed about at work?
Yeah, I think there is this general an increase in understanding.
Mm.
However, we also are not necessarily confronting the fact that the 9 to 5 is becoming extinct, and we're working in a system that, although works beneficially with flexibility, it doesn't it's not necessarily going to be this way forever, right? With the 9 to 5, sort of with Reid Hoffman's prediction.
Yeah.
But we do need to help each other create new boundaries, right? Because there is this sort of move towards flexibility. And I think we need to continue to actually talk about it and talk about what that means for us individually and as teams,
Right.
and also as organizations.
Yes, and there are also, more implications of the tough job market, and all these other implications of how things are changing, and what that means for millennials and Gen Zs in terms of the stress of not having financial security, and that means that so many are have side hustles. So I think there are a whole load of other implications that come off, a few realizations about how the situations have changed, and just like moving, further and kind of saying, well, what else does that mean for other generations, and putting ourselves in their shoes to really understand the dynamics.
Yes.
What's our next news article?
So our next story is about mental health of younger workers. And so recent findings from the APA suggest that focusing too much on personal unhappiness can lead to misery, which no brainer. But 2/3 of respondents report symptoms of burnout, and younger workers are struggling with social aspects of work. So basically, it's saying that we're all miserable. No, I'm kidding. But there is this general dissatisfaction and a concern around mental health. And I think what I'm hearing on my end from my close circles is that people are depressed and also are alone. And in the workplace, typically we also feel a little bit alone, and we also don't feel heard. And there's a general sort of acceptance amongst the older generations of well, work sucks, it's supposed to suck, right? But there's also not necessarily this recognition and any like, well, yeah, like let's do something about it, right? There's
Yeah.
sort of no like motivation to change. So how should we be dealing with mental health issues? Like, should we be addressing them at work and addressing social media and tech as sort of these
Yeah.
sources of mental health problems?
Look, I think, I certainly have heard older generations who are saying kind of like, well, they should toughen up. Those younger generations, they need to just like get on with things, being British, the keep calm and carry on. And I think we do know very much that this isn't actually the way to be addressing it. And it does, yes, if people have the language to speak about anxiety and depression, then they do appear to speak about it more, and maybe just theoretically and technically speaking about it much more. And that is beneficial. I think some of the biggest challenges are related to the fact that managers, the increased pressure on managers and the extra responsibility they have now for the well-being of their employees. It's not just about achieving business objectives and getting the projects through to meet their deadlines. It's also about helping support employees. So I think it is really, really critical that we need to be thinking about this, because we do have a much less stable situation situation, the planetary situation, there's war going on, and with AI and other technologies just disrupting people's positions and roles, people being much more worried about, the fear of becoming obsolete, the FOBO. What can that mean? So I think that is common to everybody. I think, certainly the youngest employees can be feeling that much more. So I do think we managers do need to step up. And I think when they can get more training, they can get more support, because this is new, certainly to older managers, that to feel equipped to be able to be in this situation. So I think this is a big shift, and a really important one to meet these objectives within organizations.
Definitely. And it's interesting because in how I view it is Gen Z is inclined towards this community-based
Yeah.
learning and support. And in the workplace, that can manifest as guidance for managers, as ERGs, but also we don't necessarily need to find community at work. And so there's this desire for work-life separation. There's been a rise in those types of conversations of trying to find fulfillment outside of work as well. So there's a lot going on.
There is, and there's been some really interesting talk about, particularly when people are working from home and that isolation that you're mentioning at the beginning, in terms of having local communities. So communities around where somebody is working that can also provide some of that local support that isn't connected with the office. And the managers can also encourage that can be supportive, but aren't part of the workplace, the work community, which is also very important to be cultivated.
Awesome. All right, let's move on because we are running low on time. So our blender bender for today is, what should professionalism mean? What does it mean to be professional if you want to be professional in today's workplace? We have a lot to get to. So if you have questions, please pop them in the chat and we'll get to them after time. So I've been wanting to discuss this topic for a while. So let's start by unpacking, what does professionalism mean for a company?
Oh, it's interesting to be thinking about professions, right? The core of professionalism. And there used to be a select number, a sort of specific number of professions: a doctor, a lawyer, those are some of and police officer. And think about the fact that they also had uniforms. They had sort of codes of dress that were pretty formal, and those were the visible identifiers of those professions.
Yeah, and also we can consider too that uniforms relate to professionalism. Their clothing can unify them. I was talking to Stephen Heidel about this, and providing the sense of like community, that where
Yeah.
the uniform really is unifying you. But it's also interesting to consider the fact that uniformity is different from unity, right? And
Yes.
how can we appreciate each other's uniqueness while also trying to be unified through uniform. So like
Right.
unity requires this sort of compromise.
It does, and it's that compromise, I think, that we want to have individuality, but also have that sense of connection and community that you were talking about. So I did go to look up a very interesting definition, which is from the U.S. Department of Labor about professionalism. And it says, professionalism does not mean wearing a suit, going to that uniform bit, or carrying a briefcase. Rather, it means conducting oneself with responsibility, integrity, accountability, and excellence. It means communicating effectively and appropriately, and always finding a way to be productive.
Mm.
So, what's interesting to me about that in particular is it's not definitive, right? It's not, these are terms that are subjective and open to interpretation. So it's not the same for everybody, for not, each person and each company. And I think that, one of the challenges with that is, it's like, are all the different expectations from people, which is part of the core of this episode, and are different employee groups potentially being treated differently, or they have different expectations? What are you finding?
It's interesting because I can understand for employees that are customer facing versus not, that there should be a difference.
Mhm.
But with the different standards, there is confusion across the board, and it might come across as unfair. And if
Right.
we think about professionalism as like one aspect of a manifestation of a company culture, it should
Right.
be clearly defined for everyone, much like
Yep.
values, right? And much is my opinion on expectations around being on time to work, which isn't
Mhm.
necessarily written down, but different expectations exist depending on who your boss is and the norms they set or often don't set. And that really is
Yes.
the issue, in my opinion, right? So, Sophie, as a Gen Xer, has this laid back approach always been the case for professionalism, or how has it changed over time for any company?
Well, for a start, here I am not wearing a suit jacket. And so I do appreciate the decreased formality, although every now and again wearing a cool suit is nice. But I think it's, for me, it's about comfort. It's about feeling, being able to be wearing the clothes that I feel comfortable in. So I do appreciate that what is defined as being professional has changed over time. And so it's not static. It has been moving, but it's also about how people act, right? It's not just about what they're wearing. And I think one of these things is sort of interesting to me. If we go back to that definition by the Department of Labor, and it's about, it says, talked about excellence and responsibility and accountability. So what does that mean in terms of what is needed to be behaving and acting professionally now? Doesn't that also include how we're interacting with technology and learning and upskilling for the professional or the tools that people are needing to in order to be effective today? So if people are refusing or really not engaging with new technologies, are they actually acting professionally? That's a
Right.
question.
Right. So professionalism is being proactive in learning. I like that. I like that a lot.
So you did a poll about what is considered
Yeah.
professionalism, or how people were sort of interacting or being complained about in terms of, or taken to task for not being professional. What were the key elements there?
Yeah. So 80% of the respondents
Okay.
said that they were criticized for their unprofessional behavior
Okay.
versus 60% said dress code. So obviously the numbers I added up because some people said both. So I
Okay.
added
All
those
right. Okay.
the amounts. I know 60 and 80 don't equal 100. But it's very interesting.
Yeah, so let's dig into that dress code thing, since I did bring it up just now, and delve deeper into how people are presenting themselves at work.
Yeah.
There are many complaints about younger employees not presenting themselves professionally for work, whether in a virtual situation or when they're coming to the office. For example, and particularly that their clothing is too casual. So my question to you on behalf of all of your generation is, what are they considering when they're making workwear decisions, or do so many of them just not care at all?
Good question. I would say that we're thinking about comfort. We're
Mhm.
thinking about what would make us most productive, right? Fashion, we're also big fashionistas. And maybe we're not thinking or we don't know what being professional means or looks like as much as the next person because of COVID, right? During the pandemic,
Mm.
norms were broken. They were ill defined, but at the same time we still had to show up. So, Sophie, what do you feel like you're supposed to wear, and how do you feel about it?
Well, it's not so defined, and as I said, I appreciate the fact that it's not as formal as it was, and part of that is cost, because
Yeah.
formal suits, they are expensive, and there's upkeep and dry cleaning, things like that. But I'm very thoughtful about who I'm meeting with, whether it's virtually or in person. I want to make sure that I feel comfortable, but I also feel that whatever I'm wearing is not going to be a distraction. I'm not going to be standing out. I want to make sure that there is a sort of comfort level. We're within a range that I'm sort of thinking about how the other people are going to be reacting or noticing what I'm wearing. So I am thoughtful about how I present myself, and I think there are different codes, and different people expect different things, but it isn't clearly defined. And I can certainly understand that it is confusing when people are working from home wearing certain things, and they come to the office, and then there are new expectations that haven't been explicitly or openly discussed and specified. Kind of like, we will think about you in a certain way if you don't dress differently.
Right. Yeah. Right. And there's
And
also
so
this.
and so how do you see that in terms of, there are issues in terms of making people, allowing people to feel comfortable and feeling that they belong in a community? How do you see
Right.
that being interpreted or being experienced by younger generations?
Yeah. It's interesting because we're being told to show up as our authentic selves, right?
Right.
Across the board, no matter what generation you are. And certain minority groups, women also, are having to navigate these
Mm,
questions of, well, can I be myself? How much
right.
can I be myself? Am I representing who I am? Am I comfortable enough so I can work effectively? That's, a big part for this younger generation too. And so we're balancing being aligned with a company and corporate culture, and
Mhm.
also in how we dress and present ourselves, while also considering if the company is the right fit for us. And there's
Yep.
constantly this sort of conversation that we're having within our head. And so if the idea is to bring your full self to work, so like what does it take to build? And
Mm,
what I would say is this sort of trust, the shared values and the common
yep.
culture, but ultimately needs to be defined to a certain extent.
Yes, and I think what's interesting about that, going to the fact that, when we're talking about uniformity and unity and there being that compromise, so there needs to be some wiggle room, some range within that in order to create that unity, so that you can show up differently to me, but we can both feel comfortable, both for ourselves and with each other. And I think
Yeah.
trying to understand what that range is, it is something that in many situations has not been discussed and has not been clarified. And I think that's where a lot of the discord and some conflict can arise, and making assumptions and judgments about people.
Definitely. And let's kind of move on to, I think, the
Yep.
next second key issue, which was behavior. And
Mhm.
let's address some particular complaints, which is how should you act during the recruitment and resignation process?
Mm.
So Gen Z is continuously told that we're job hoppers. And we're also told that it isn't professional to change your job. But some people recognize that as the norm, but I still feel like we're being discredited when we do change jobs, maybe after a year. So, how did your generation define job hopping? Especially given that the average tenure in tech, for example, is 18 months or maybe something like that. Is it fair to be judging us as professional by moving jobs more frequently than you did?
Well, I will go straight to the fact that whatever it was then, it is different now. And so I really have an issue with the job hopping term, because there is a huge assumption, which is that that person is not serious about their job
Yeah.
and that they are not loyal to their company. And it may be a very, very different situation, because now that companies are much flatter with the future of work, we need to be more nimble, and so less structure, fewer layers of hierarchy, and therefore it's actually much harder for young employees to be moving up in their career, because sometimes they need to move horizontally, sometimes they need to move diagonally, and that internal mobility is not yet achieved in most organizations. Only a third. There was LinkedIn data about 6 months ago that showed only a third of organizations are set up for that internal talent mobility. And
Wow.
therefore, it is very hard to move internally. And therefore, so many employees are having to leave their organization in order to sort of move up in their career, to make career progress, and to acquire more skills, which is incredibly important for them to maintain competitiveness. So I think that is one aspect that I don't see it as being job hopping. I see it as being sort of necessary in terms of career development and progress.
Right.
And also, new jobs are popping up all over the place all the time. So what about exploring? Can't we, look at that in a different light as well? Because I want to try and sort of see what else is going on.
Yeah, and I've personally always been told that your 20s are for exploration, especially within your career.
Yes, and I think, if you don't know where you're going in your career, because so much is changing, that exploration is very valid and very important. So I think really taking a very different approach to what those changes in career path mean and how the environment has changed, going back to the sort of what the boomer was saying, that's really important, so that what professional means has changed very specifically in this example.
Right. One could argue it's more professional to change your job to acquire new skills. Hello, let's do it.
Exactly. So, okay, what about ghosting? We've like when we're talking about the interview
Yeah,
situation,
our
and there
biggest
have been
complaints.
yes, recruiters have talked to me about the fact that they might have interviewed a candidate and they thought it went really well, they're really enthusiastic, but they never hear from the candidate again. Is ghosting like that? Do you think that's professional?
I don't think ghosting is professional. However,
Okay.
in that same article that we were talking about, that the boomer notices that the employers never get back to candidates, and I've definitely experienced this in my own life,
Okay.
unless they are interested in hiring them. So is that professional behavior? Like, it might be accepted now, but that certainly wasn't professional before. So it goes both ways. And here's what I say about Gen Z is that we're very much a generation that follows the other person's lead. And so if you
Mm.
want respect, you have to show respect. If you want communication, you have to be communicative. Throughout the whole process, you have to show up consistently. And in a lot of ways, we feel like we're being disrespected by older generations, not just in the working world, but also through politics and whatnot, and the norms that we encounter within the recruitment process.
Fair point. Okay, great. So, all the generations, let's all take note here. It's about modeling the behavior that we want to see in these
Yeah.
type of examples. So,
Yeah.
fair enough.
But talking about this same recruitment process, specifically the interview, what do
Mm,
you think about what's discussed during the job interview? Because we've talked about the appropriateness of asking about work life balance and getting judged quite harshly about that. So, is it unprofessional to ask that given that we highly value work life balance?
look, I have certainly heard negative reactions to people who have asked about work-life balance in the interview. They have been judged or assumed to be lazy, is one word that came up, which I don't think is fair. I think there's a huge assumption about why somebody is asking that okay, they don't have a good work ethic, they're not going to work very hard because they want to, that's what they're focused on, to be asking it at such an important point in the process. But I do think it is really important for employees or candidates and their potential employer to be trying to find out what whether there's a good fit, culturally and otherwise, and sort of understanding what those values and norms are. So I think, sometimes depending on the situation, depending on the person, it could be wiser to try and find that information out from someone else or through another network, or trying to find out from the website or something like that. But I do think it is important to be able to have a conversation, to be able to surface and discuss some of the key aspects of what a job is going to entail and what the norms are and how these interactions and how all these different aspects, which are becoming more and more important, particularly when we're going through so much change and there is so much evolution about how these things are going to be addressed. So I do think that bringing up these questions is important.
Yeah, and to some degree, right, there are situations where people will be flat out honest about what they're looking for.
Yeah.
And I've heard time and time again, I'm looking to hire someone, who isn't an Ivy League dud, like literally, quote unquote. But someone who is straight out of high school and knows how to work hard. And
Mhm.
I've even heard of a situation in an interview where the CEO said to the interviewee, oh, I've interviewed 3 people for this role in the past 18 months, and we've had a bunch of turnover. And I'm looking for someone who won't prioritize, their band over work and will stay past 5 p.m. and is willing to put in the extra work. And to some degree, I think it's a little bit of an unfair expectation, right? What we have an unhealthy relationship to work in the US. And I think it's something that Gen Z recognizes and wants to change and is seeking to change. And everyone's kind of rallying for Gen Z to change it, but secretly, maybe also there's people who are very much against that. And I think, that's a difficult situation to sort of navigate. That's where a lot of the tension arises. But I also would be curious to hear too, what's appropriate to say in an interview, like regarding, work-life balance and yeah, like that's a good question.
So to that issue about sort of about the band and leaving at before 7 o'clock or something like that, I think one thing that's important is that we do move to be focusing on results, because when we focus on results, and if the woman or man is getting their job done and that they have a
Right.
really great outlet for their enthusiasm and energy in their personal lives, which is being in a band, then their boss can actually celebrate, or the CEO can celebrate it, as long as if they're getting the work done. And if they're not, then how can they be oriented and organize their work differently so that they can actually do both of these things? Because I think when we are able to be all of who we are, then it actually enables us to engage, to be focused on the right things at work, and really do perform at our best. So I do see that the change that needs to happen is really to be focusing on results, which we haven't done in the past. It really has been, how many hours are we at the office?
Yeah.
And so that is a big shift for older leaders to make because of what they're used to. But it is really necessary so that we don't have this conflict, we don't have the judgments and assumptions that are made about whether somebody's working hard or not. So there's one thing that I do want to ask you in terms of, like, let's just say that guy girl woman who's in the band, and they are annoyed with how they feel disrespected because of how they're being judged if they do leave at 5 o'clock, having done their work. What happens if they just walk out and they quit and they don't say anything? Ghosting at that end. What do you think about that then? What happens then? Because we do know that this happens, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I've definitely heard my fair share of stories of simply never showing up to work again, or quitting. And yeah, I think this is a last resort in many cases. I feel like if you're at a point where you're just walking out, it means that you up until this point have not felt heard, and maybe you've tried
Mm,
to voice your concerns in the past,
okay.
and you're fed up, you feel disrespected, and like I said before, you're going to meet disrespect with disrespect.
Mm,
And I also think to a certain degree this generation is avoidant of confrontation and conflict,
mm.
and not necessarily sure of how to deal with it, maybe don't have the right mentorship or guidance in place to help them. And I think that's probably also a big piece of this.
Yes, I really hear you on that, and I think that's where this shift towards empathetic leadership. So one, those conversations, it never has to get to that point that somebody it is a last resort. And if somebody doesn't feel that they can speak up, they can't even speak up to their teammate and kind of, voice some of their issues, but they can much earlier than that be talking to their manager and trying to work to find a solution to have a better alignment with their skills and their strengths, maybe, or maybe be on a different team, so that they don't have to be walking out in that sort of desperate fashion, because it does have huge implications, or can have huge implications for
Yeah.
that person when they go on to then trying to find their next job, not just their confidence, but obviously having a reference and stuff like that. So I
Mhm.
think empathetic, having better relationships, being able to have better conversations, it all goes back up to that conflict resolution as
Definitely.
well. So let's discuss some solutions as well here, and what can companies do to be creating an environment where there is agreement and understanding about what professionalism means now.
Yeah. Well, for me, I think that when we think about professionalism, it's very much a personal sort of decision of like, well, how am I going to show up professionally, right? And I think that has a big part of that is really being able to voice your own boundaries and
Mhm.
and knowing yourself, right? And knowing like what feels professional to you. and being able to sort of really understand, well, okay, how does this context of me like fit into the context of the organization?
Right.
But I'd be curious to hear sort of more of what you think about setting boundaries at work and how we should be doing it.
I think it's interesting that you bring up boundaries in terms of Gen Z, because I think one of the huge challenges for Gen Z is when you've grown up or come into the workplace where there aren't boundaries with terms of like beginning and the end of the day, or it being a place, work being a place rather than now that it's an activity. So I think boundaries are challenging, and I do see all the generations can be very, very helpful to setting boundaries, helping young employees set boundaries. And I think, therefore, articulation of what those boundaries are, what some of these definitions are, that aren't absolutes, right? So I think there needs to be understanding, wiggle room, and support that are specific. And there are certainly, we know that there are companies in Silicon Valley, that was where the t-shirts and chinos were,
Yeah.
were really being sort of enjoyed for the first time, again, sort of in contrast to Wall Street and the suits. So now it's much more, it's sort of, there's casual, there's much more formal, and it really depends on the company. And I think that as a result, that can be very confusing. And I think it when there's also assumptions of, I'm just used to this and I've been doing it like this for a very long time, and somebody else has very different understanding of norms, they have different boundaries, that having those conversations, one, can bring people together and really start to explore and explain what their boundaries are, how they feel, what makes them uncomfortable about clothing, about behaviors, about talking loudly at the office when they're there. There are so many different things in terms of actions, behaviors, and present and ways we're presenting ourselves, that having those conversations and being explicit and negotiating and compromising, I think, brings us together in very new and important ways.
And I love that. And to your point too, this is a big thing that I talk about, which is friendship. Like
Yes.
friendship is literally built to bring us together and to talk about these random things, right? So like with mentorship, if anyone doesn't know what it means, it's this bidirectional mentorship sort of situation where it's built on this mutual authenticity, trust, and communication. And it really is the goal is to learn from each other. And
Yep.
so, right, like what can I learn, what can I leave, and what can I leverage to help me towards my goals and to help this organization fulfill its own goals. And and it's interesting because through those conversations, you then come up with a code of conduct. You
Mhm.
kind of
Yep.
understand through osmosis and maybe also through defining what the rules are.
Yep.
And in the community world, there are codes of conduct. There are rules to say, okay, this is what's not accepted, and this is what
Mhm.
is accepted. And if you cross a boundary here, this is what's going to happen. And it's just interesting because I think there's such a huge connection between internal community and like public community or like
Mhm.
outside external community. And another one that we addressed too was how we communicate differently or not at all. And
Yes.
like I mentioned before with the slang dictionary, coming up with solutions like that are really organic in nature rather than just sort of like ignoring that there's an elephant in the room, and actually addressing it and being like,
Yeah.
oh no, we need to understand what these terms mean, because our user base is largely Gen Z,
Right.
or for some other reason. I think is a beautiful example of how we can build solutions.
Exactly. And making the effort to bridge the gap and say, hey, do you want to look at this dictionary, because that's kind of like how we're speaking these days,
Yeah.
and the interrelation, so there is a common language. It's not all about the slang, it's not about no slang, but trying to sort of meet somewhere in the middle. I think it's so important, because that's when we have a common language and we are giving each other space to not understand or to make mistakes. I think those are the things for me in terms of empathy, and having these friendships that allow us to have better relationships, more trust-based relationships, that we can give each other, be more open to each other and not afraid to speak up. I do really totally recognize that Gen Zs are very worried about speaking up for job-related, situations. And so those are, and anxiety and depression, all those things that I think it really, really is important to have those type of really different relationships. Don't have to be friends, but we do. I mean, the friendship is in there, but I think it goes to the fact of that we have a closer interaction. We understand
Right.
each other better, and that allows us to communicate so much better and more clearly and more effectively.
Definitely. Okay. Well,
So I think that's it. And
yeah.
we haven't had time for questions this time. But as you were saying, anybody who has questions, please I hope you've been putting them in the chat, because I can't see the chat. And we will definitely be answering them, right, Danielle?
Yes, in the comments, we'll be answering them. Leave additional questions if you didn't get to tune in live. And thank you so much for joining us. It's we're definitely trying to create some more smooth communications, and we'll also be creating a short list of takeaways,
Yep.
which we called our blender insights or smoothie insights. I don't remember what we ended up calling it, which we'll post next week to summarize the key points of this conversation.
Yes, thank you for being here. And we haven't decided what the topic is for next month, but we will be back again, helping try and solve some of the blending some of the generations, and so we can have better communications. Look forward to seeing you then.
Awesome.